The frame freezes on a cracked touchscreen, still seated in its rubber armor sleeve, resting on the torn floor plate of a burned-out MT-LBu. Helmet camera footage from the Avdiivka sector, geolocated to the tree lines south of the city, shows a Ukrainian assault trooper turning the device over in gloved hands before passing it back down the line. This is the object at the center of today's analysis, a ruggedized command tablet pulled from a destroyed Russian support vehicle during the chaotic final weeks of the fight for Avdiivka in the opening months of 2024. What was loaded on that tablet, according to Ukrainian accounts that later circulated through military channels and at least one interview segment on Ukrainian defense television, was a mine-laying overlay, a digital sketch of where a Russian engineer battalion believed its own minefields began and ended. And according to the soldiers who recovered it, that sketch did not match the ground they were standing on. Let's start with where this happened, because geography does the heavy lifting in explaining why it mattered. Avdiivka, by late 2023, had become one of the most fought-over patches of ground in the entire war. Russian forces opened a renewed offensive against the city in October 2023, throwing armor forward in waves that open-source analysts and Western officials described at the time as some of the heaviest mechanized losses of the war in a matter of days. Dozens of vehicles destroyed in the approaches to the coke plant and the southern industrial belt within the first 2 weeks alone, according to lost trackers built from geolocated visual evidence. The city itself sat on elevated ground. The Ukrainian military had fortified since 2014, and its capture became a symbolic and operational priority for Moscow, heading into the anniversary of the full-scale invasion. By January and into February of 2024, the fight had shifted from a grinding frontal assault into something closer to an encirclement threat. Russian units pushed to close a pincer around the southern flank of the city, threatening the routes Ukrainian forces used to resupply and eventually to withdraw. It was in this period, the last chaotic weeks before Ukraine's general staff ordered a withdrawal from Avdiivka in mid-February 2024, that additional Ukrainian brigades were pushed into the sector to stabilize the flanks and help cover an orderly pullback. Azov, by then operating as a reformed and expanded brigade-sized formation after its earlier units had been lost in the siege of Mariupol 2 years prior, was among the formations sent into that southern approach. Their task, as described in the unit's own public statements from the period, was rearguard work, holding tree lines and strongpoints long enough for other units to disengage, then falling back themselves under fire. It's in exactly this kind of terrain, contested tree lines, shifting front lines, positions that changed hands multiple times in a single week, that minefields become both essential and treacherous. Both sides mined extensively around Avdiivka. Russian engineer units laid mines to blunt Ukrainian counterpushes and to protect their own flanks as they advanced. Ukrainian engineers did the same in reverse. The problem, which shows up again and again in accounts from combat engineers on both sides of this war, is that a minefield is only as useful as the record of where it is. A mine that isn't marked, or is marked wrong, doesn't discriminate by uniform. The vehicle the tablet came out of was an MT-LBu, a tracked, lightly armored multi-purpose chassis that the Soviet and now Russian military have used for decades as a flexible base platform. It's not a frontline tank, and it's rarely the vehicle people picture when they think armor. It has thin aluminum armor rated to stop small arms and shell fragments, not anti-tank rounds, and it's amphibious, riding on a wide, low ground pressure track layout originally designed for use in Arctic and swampy terrain, but that same flexible chassis makes it a workhorse for support roles, command posts, artillery fire direction vehicles, ambulances, and, relevant here, engineering and reconnaissance variants used by combat engineer units to move forward observers, minefield clearance teams, and their associated command and control equipment close to the front line. Finding a digital command tablet inside a knocked-out MT-LBu, rather than inside a tank or an infantry fighting vehicle, fits a pattern OSINT researchers have flagged repeatedly over the past 2 years. These support vehicles, precisely because they're less heavily armored and often move with a smaller escort, have become one of the more productive sources of captured Russian digital equipment when they're destroyed or abandoned close to Ukrainian lines. The tablet itself is worth pausing on, because its existence tells its own story about how the Russian military has tried, unevenly, to digitize its command structure over the course of this war. Russia entered the full-scale invasion with large parts of its lower echelon command running on paper maps, grease pencils, and voice radio, a system that had worked, more or less, in previous conflicts fought at a smaller scale and tempo. Confronted with a war that demanded faster targeting cycles and better situational awareness, Russian units began fielding a patchwork of digital command tools. The Strelets reconnaissance and fire control terminals issued to some artillery and infantry units, civilian Android tablets loaded with mapping and messaging software for lower units that never got proper military-grade kit, and various in-house engineering applications used to plot minefields, obstacle belts, and fire support coordination lines. Ukrainian intelligence services and independent OSINT groups have published analyses of captured devices from this ecosystem multiple times over the course of the war, sometimes revealing unit identifiers, sometimes revealing entire chat logs, and, in cases like the one described here, revealing the underlying data files that these units actually worked from day to day. What Ukrainian engineers who examined the recovered device reportedly found was not a sophisticated geospatial information system with live, editable minefield polygons tied to GPS coordinates. It was, according to the account given in the interview segment that first brought this story into public view, closer to a static image, a screenshot-style overlay, essentially an annotated picture pasted onto a base map, showing where an engineer battalion's minefields were supposed to be. That distinction matters enormously to anyone who has worked with digital mapping. A living GIS layer updates, can be corrected in the field, and forces every user looking at it to see the same current version. A flattened image, once created, is frozen. If the ground truth shifts, because a unit relays a belt, because artillery fire disturbs a section, because a follow-on unit adds mines without updating the master file, the picture on the tablet simply stops being true, and nothing in the file itself warns the person looking at it that anything has changed. According to the timestamps examined after the tablet's recovery, the mine-laying overlay file had reportedly last been modified roughly 6 weeks before the unit that lost the tablet deployed into that stretch of the line. 6 weeks is not, on its face, an alarming gap for a static reference document. But 6 weeks in the Avdiivka sector in the winter of 2023 into 2024 was an eternity by the standards of how fast the front line was actually moving. Positions that had been in Russian hands could be lost and retaken by Ukrainian counterattacks within days. Engineers' subunits laid supplementary mines to shore up gaps as infantry positions shifted. Under those conditions, a 6-week-old snapshot of where our mines are is less a map than a historical document, useful for understanding intent, dangerous if mistaken for current fact. The account that circulated afterward, again, sourced to combat engineer interviews and Azov's own reconstruction of the incident, rather than to any single verified document we can point to independently, described the practical consequence in blunt terms. Soldiers moving through what the file told them was a cleared, marked corridor were, in places, walking through ground the file simply had wrong. Reports put the discrepancy at up to roughly 180 meters in some sections, a gap large enough to place an entire firing position, or a section of a communication trench, inside what should have been safe ground. We should be careful here, because we cannot independently verify that precise figure from primary documentation. It comes from the secondary reporting that followed the tablet's recovery, and figures like this tend to get rounded and repeated in retelling. What is more solidly established, both from this specific account and from a broader pattern that Ukrainian sappers and Western military analysts have described throughout the war, is the mechanism: static, outdated overlays feeding real decisions about where it's safe to walk. So how does an error like this actually happen inside a functioning, if strained, military bureaucracy? The most plausible explanation, and the one described by the Ukrainian engineers who examined the file, is depressingly mundane rather than dramatic, a copy-paste error somewhere up the chain. Battalion-level engineering officers in a fast-moving sector are frequently working from overlays handed down by a higher headquarters, a brigade or divisional engineering staff that consolidates minefield reports from multiple subordinate units into a single master picture. If that master overlay contains an error, whether from a transcription mistake, a misaligned map layer, or simply reusing an older file as a template for a new one, and no one at battalion level cross-checks it against what their own engineers actually laid on the ground, the mistake propagates downward with the full authority of an official document behind it. Nobody who touches that file after the error is introduced necessarily has a reason to doubt it. It looks official. It has the right map, the right sector markings, the right unit designators. It's simply wrong, and wrong in a way that's invisible until someone's boot finds the gap. This is where the story becomes less about one unlucky tablet and more about a structural pattern that OSINT analysts and Ukrainian military commentators have pointed to repeatedly over the course of the war. Russian battalion-level combat engineering, in significant part, still runs on what amounts to static picture files, rather than living geospatial data. Interviews with Ukrainian sappers who have examined captured Russian engineering materials, including segments aired on Ukrainian Defense Affairs programming that cover exactly this kind of battlefield forensics, describe a recurring theme. Minefield records exist as flattened images, sometimes hand-annotated screenshots of a base map, passed between headquarters levels essentially as attachments rather than as an editable, authoritative single source of truth. Every time that file is copied, annotated further, and passed along, there's an opportunity for drift between what the picture says and what's actually buried in the ground. And once a static image has been created, there's no built-in mechanism forcing anyone to reconcile it against reality before the next unit relies on it. It's worth being fair to the scale of the problem here, because this isn't unique to to one army or one war. Battlefield minefield record-keeping has been a chronic weak point across militaries throughout history. Even NATO forces, with considerably more resources poured into digital command systems, have documented incidents of friendly units encountering their own uncleared or unmarked mines due to recording and handoff failures. What distinguishes the pattern described around Avdiivka is the specific technological choice. Rather than adopting a shared, editable geospatial layer that every relevant unit can update and pull from in near real time, the informal workaround that seems to have taken root in parts of the Russian engineering corps is closer to passing around annotated screenshots, a solution that scales adequately when the front line is static for months and fails in exactly the way described here, when the front line is moving by tens or hundreds of meters in a matter of days, as it was around Avdiivka's southern flank in early 2024. None of this should be read as suggesting Ukrainian forces have solved this problem on their own side. Ukrainian combat engineers have spoken publicly, including in the same category of interview programming referenced here, about their own struggles reconciling minefield records across units, particularly during rapid rotations and the chaos of a fighting withdrawal, which is precisely the kind of Operation Azov's rearguard action around Avdiivka was. Mine warfare, by its nature, punishes imprecision on both sides of a front line, and both militaries in this war have had to relearn, under fire, lessons about digital record discipline that older, more static wars didn't force as urgently. The value of examining a captured device like this one isn't to score a point about one army's technology being inferior. Plenty of Russian units have fielded genuinely capable digital tools, and plenty of Ukrainian units have made their own recording errors under the same pressures. It's to understand a mechanism that recurs across this entire war. The moment a digital record stops being treated as a living, correctable thing and starts being treated as a finished picture, it becomes a liability the instant the ground underneath it changes. There's also an intelligence dimension to why a find like this mattered beyond the immediate tactical warning it gave to the soldiers who recovered it. Captured command devices, when they survive contact intact enough to be read, have repeatedly given Ukrainian military intelligence and independent researchers a window into how Russian units at the battalion and company level actually organize their information. Not the polished doctrine described in training manuals, but the working reality of what gets typed into a tablet at 2 in the morning during a rotation under artillery fire. Files like a mine-laying overlay, precisely because they're mundane administrative documents rather than dramatic intercepted orders, tend to reveal more about systemic habits than any single captured order ever could. A one-off intercepted attack order tells you what happened on one night. A stale engineering file with a demonstrable, measurable error tells you something about how an entire echelon of a military handles its own record-keeping under sustained pressure, and that's a pattern with implications well beyond the specific tree line where this tablet was recovered. It's also worth noting what this kind of recovery does and doesn't prove, because OSINT analysis lives or dies on being honest about its own limits. We can be reasonably confident, based on the underlying pattern documented across multiple engineer interviews and captured device analyses over the course of the war, that mismatches between official minefield overlays and ground truth are a real and recurring problem in at least parts of the Russian engineering corps. We are considerably less certain about the precise chain of events that produced this specific tablet's error, whether it really was a simple copy-paste mistake at a higher headquarters, whether the 6-week-old file had simply never been updated after a subsequent relaying operation, or whether some other administrative failure was to blame. The account that reached the public came through soldier interviews and a limited declassification, not through a full forensic report released for independent verification, and it should be treated with the same caution any single-source battlefield account deserves: informative, plausible, consistent with a broader documented pattern, but not proven down to the meter. What the broader tree line reconnaissance and battle damage assessment imagery from the same sector does support is the general picture of contested, heavily cratered, repeatedly fought over ground south of Avdiivka during this period. Aerial and drone-sourced imagery from the sector shows exactly the kind of churned terrain, collapsed tree lines, and overlapping fighting positions that would make maintaining an accurate minefield record genuinely difficult even for a well-organized unit, let alone one working from outdated static files under fire. That context doesn't excuse the error, but it does help explain how an administrative mistake made weeks earlier, at a headquarters far from the front, could translate into real danger for infantry who had no way of knowing the picture they'd been handed no longer matched the ground beneath their boots. The wider lesson that OSINT analysts have drawn from incidents like this one, across the length of this war, is about the gap between having digital tools and having digital discipline. Issuing tablets to lower echelons is a meaningful step toward modern command and control, but a tablet loaded with a stale, unverifiable image file isn't meaningfully better than a paper map with the same flaw. It just looks more authoritative while being just as wrong. The technology, in other words, didn't create the discipline problem. It inherited it, and in some ways amplified it, because a digital file on a ruggedized tablet carries an implicit assurance of currency and accuracy that a hand-annotated paper map never quite pretended to offer. Soldiers trust the glowing screen a little more than they'd trust a photocopied sketch, even when both are equally out of date. For Azov's assault group that pulled this device out of the wreck, the tablet's greater value in the end wasn't tactical. By the time it was examined, the specific minefield it described was already behind shifting lines, part of a sector the unit itself would soon be withdrawing from as part of the broader pullback from Avdiivka in mid-February 2024. Its value was evidentiary and structural, proof, in the form of timestamps and a mismatched overlay, of exactly the kind of record-keeping failure that engineer interviews and open-source analysts had been describing anecdotally for months. A single tablet doesn't rewrite an assessment of an entire army's engineering doctrine, but it does turn a pattern that analysts had inferred from interviews and captured fragments into something closer to documented case evidence, a dated file, a measurable discrepancy, and a chain of custody that, however imperfect, ties an abstract criticism to one specific piece of ground on one specific stretch of front line. That's ultimately the value of this kind of recovered device analysis in a war being fought, on both sides, with a mixture of legacy paper-based habits and half-adopted digital tools. Every destroyed vehicle that yields an intact tablet, log, or radio is a small opportunity to check the gap between what a military says it does and what its soldiers were actually working from that week. In this case, the gap ran to something like 180 meters of disagreement between a slide on a screen and the dirt underneath it, a distance that, on a battlefield already saturated with artillery, drone strikes, and close-range infantry contact, was more than enough to turn a supposedly cleared corridor into exactly the kind of ground no infantryman wants to be walking through unaware. The tablet is gone now, logged, examined, and presumably filed away in whatever archive holds this war's slowly accumulating record of captured digital evidence. But the pattern it exposed, static pictures standing in for living data, at the exact layer of command where that distinction gets people killed, is one that has outlived the device itself, and one that continues to shape how both militaries, however unevenly, are being forced to relearn the discipline of keeping a map honest.